Hello there, fellow truth seekers and mystery enthusiasts. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're having a great day, wherever you are in the world. Whether it's morning coffee in New York, afternoon tea in London, or a late night wind down in Tokyo, thank you for choosing to spend this time with us here at Sleep Theories. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing for more thought-provoking stories that explore the strange, the hidden, and the unanswered. And as always, I want to hear from you. What do you think about the Devon Island theory? Could NASA really be using a remote island on Earth to stage footage of Mars? Is the red planet closer than we think, or farther than we've ever truly gone? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let us know which conspiracies you'd like to see covered next. Your ideas help guide what we explore. Now, settle in, and get ready to question everything you thought you knew about space exploration. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2027, buried between spam messages and LinkedIn notifications. Silas Rourke almost deleted it, mistaking the sender's address for another phishing attempt, but the subject line stopped him cold. Immediate contract opportunity. Devon Island Geological Survey. Devon Island. Even the name sent a chill through him. Silas had spent the last 5 years analysing satellite imagery for various aerospace contractors, his days consumed by pixel-perfect examinations of terrain that most humans would never see in person. At 32, he'd developed an eye for inconsistencies that his supervisors both valued and feared. His last position had ended abruptly when he'd questioned discrepancies in some orbital photography, asking too many questions about why certain images seemed staged. The email was from Dr. Kiran Solvi, Director of Field Operations for Volstrix Dynamics. The company name was familiar. They'd been mentioned in aerospace journals as a NASA contractor specialising in Mars mission preparation. The offer was generous. 3 months on Devon Island, Canada, conducting geological surveys for future off-world missions. The pay was almost too good to be true. Silas read the email 3 times before responding. He'd heard about Devon Island, the largest uninhabited island on Earth, located in the Canadian Arctic. Its barren, crater-scarred landscape was so similar to Mars that NASA had been using it as a training ground for years. The isolation appealed to him. After months of unemployment and mounting bills, the contract felt like salvation. Within 48 hours, he was on a plane to Resolute Bay, Nunavut. The flight to Devon Island was unlike anything Silas had experienced. The small charter plane carried only 8 passengers, all bound for the same destination. His fellow travellers were an interesting mix. A field biologist named Talia with kind eyes and nervous energy. A stoic mission director who introduced himself simply as Dr. Solvi. And several technical specialists who spoke in hushed tones about equipment protocols and communication blackouts. As the plane descended toward Devon Island, Silas pressed his face to the small window. The landscape below was alien. Rust-coloured earth stretched endlessly, broken only by ancient impact craters and the occasional rocky outcrop. It looked exactly like the Mars surface images he'd studied countless times in his career. The resemblance was uncanny, almost too perfect. The landing strip was nothing more than a graded dirt runway, but the infrastructure surrounding it was surprisingly sophisticated. Silas counted at least a dozen black shipping containers arranged in precise geometric patterns, connected by cables and surrounded by communication arrays that seemed far too advanced for a simple geological survey. Drones circled overhead in predetermined patterns, their cameras tracking the new arrivals. "Welcome to Mars," Dr. Solvi said with a thin smile as they disembarked. "You're home for the next 3 months." The comment struck Silas as odd. Most people would have said, "Welcome to Devon Island," or "Welcome to the Arctic." But Dr. Solvi had said Mars, as if the location's resemblance to the red planet was its primary identity. During the initial briefing, held in a heated container that served as the mission's command centre, Silas learned that their official purpose was to evaluate geological formations and test equipment for future Mars missions. The work seemed straightforward enough. Take samples, analyse terrain, and document everything for NASA's archives. But there were unusual restrictions that set his analytical mind on edge. No personal phones were allowed. All communication with the outside world had to go through official channels, using encrypted tablets provided by Volstrix. The internet connection was heavily filtered, with access limited to specific scientific databases and approved communication platforms. Even more strangely, they were required to maintain radio silence during certain hours of the day, with no explanation provided for these communication blackouts. Security protocols, Dr. Solvey explained when Silas questioned the restrictions. We're testing sensitive equipment here. Can't have any unauthorized signals interfering with our work. The explanation felt rehearsed, like a line from a script. That first night, Silas lay in his assigned bunk, listening to the Arctic wind howl across the barren landscape. The accommodation was a modified shipping container, surprisingly comfortable but completely isolated from the outside world. Through the small window, he could see the communication arrays blinking in the darkness, their lights creating an almost hypnotic pattern against the starless sky. Something felt wrong about this place, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. The first week on Devon Island passed in a blur of routine geological surveys and equipment testing. Silas found himself working closely with Talia, the field biologist, whose job was to study extremophile organisms that might provide insights into potential Martian life. She was intelligent and observant, with a background in astrobiology that made her invaluable to the mission. It was Talia who first pointed out the inconsistencies. "Have you noticed the rover tracks?" she asked during their third day of fieldwork. They were standing near a section of terrain that NASA claimed to use for rover simulations, examining the reddish soil that looked remarkably similar to Martian regolith. Silas looked where she was pointing. Clear tyre tracks crisscrossed the area in complex patterns, some overlapping others in ways that suggested multiple passes over the same ground. But here was the strange part. According to their mission schedule, the rover simulations weren't supposed to begin for another 2 weeks. "Maybe they're from previous missions," Silas suggested, though he wasn't convinced by his own explanation. "Look at the degradation pattern," Talia said, kneeling to examine the tracks more closely. "These are fresh, maybe a few days old at most, but the weather reports show we had a sandstorm last week that should have erased any surface markings." Silas pulled out his tablet and accessed the mission archives. The official record showed no rover activity on Devon Island for the past 6 months. According to Volstrax's documentation, this was the first operational mission of the year. "That's impossible," he muttered, comparing the physical evidence with the digital records. "Either the records are wrong, or someone's been running rover simulations without documenting them," Talia finished. They spent the next hour photographing the tracks and taking detailed measurements. The tyre patterns were consistent with NASA's current Mars rover design, but the paths seemed almost too perfect, following routes that would provide ideal camera angles and dramatic geological backdrops. It was as if someone had choreographed the rover's movement for maximum visual impact. That evening, Silas decided to do some digging. Using his encrypted tablet, he accessed Volstrax's internal network and began searching for any reference to previous Devon Island missions. The search results were frustratingly sparse, just vague references to preparatory surveys and equipment calibration, with no detailed logs or photographic evidence. But buried in a technical support forum, he found something interesting. A post from a Volstrax technician dated 3 months earlier mentioned troubleshooting Studio B connectivity issues on Devon Island. The post had been quickly deleted, but cached fragments remained in the system. Studio B. That was a designation he hadn't heard during any of their briefings. The next morning, Silas set out to explore the island more thoroughly. The official mission area was relatively small, confined to a valley between 2 low ridges. But Devon Island was enormous, over 21,000 square miles of uninhabited wilderness. Surely there were areas beyond their designated zone that might hold answers. He found Studio B by accident, following a set of heavy vehicle tracks that led away from the main camp. The tracks were partially obscured by recent snowfall, but they formed a clear path toward a cluster of boulders about 2 miles from the official mission perimeter. Hidden among the rocks was a structure that definitely wasn't in any of the mission documentation. It looked like a large shipping container, but heavily modified with additional ventilation systems and what appeared to be a satellite uplink array. A discreet sign near the entrance read, "Studio B, authorized personnel only." The entrance was secured with a biometric scanner, far more sophisticated than anything else Silas had seen on the island. When he approached, the scanner activated automatically, bathing his face in red light before flashing an "access denied" message. He circled the structure, looking for windows or any other way to see inside. The building was completely sealed, with no external indication of its purpose, but the ventilation system was running constantly, and he could hear the faint hum of electronic equipment from within. On his way back to camp, Silas noticed something else that made his pulse quicken. Mounted on a nearby ridge was a high-resolution camera system, perfectly positioned to capture the main rover testing area. The camera wasn't part of the official mission equipment. He'd memorized every piece of technology listed in their operational briefing. That night he shared his discoveries with Talia during their evening meal. They sat in the communal dining container, speaking in whispers, while the other team members focused on their own conversations. "I've been noticing things too," Talia admitted. "The communication blackouts always seem to coincide with drone activity, and yesterday I saw Dr. Solvi uploading files to a server that's not part of our official network." "What kind of files?" "Video footage, Mars rover footage, or at least footage that looked like it was from Mars, but the timestamp showed it was recorded here, on Devon Island." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic weather. "Are you saying they're filming fake Mars footage?" "I don't know what I'm saying yet, but something's not right about this place." They agreed to continue investigating, but carefully. Whatever was happening on Devon Island, it was clearly being kept secret from most of the mission team. They needed more evidence before drawing any conclusions. The opportunity came during their second week, when a severe weather system moved across the island. The storm brought blinding snow and winds that made outdoor work impossible, forcing the entire team to remain in the heated containers for 36 hours. But weather emergencies also meant relaxed security protocols. During the storm, normal communication blackouts were suspended, and the constant drone surveillance was grounded. It was the perfect time for Silas to make his move. He waited until 2 a.m. when the camp was quiet except for the howling wind. Using a maintenance access code he'd observed Dr. Solvi enter earlier that week, Silas slipped out of his accommodation and made his way through the storm towards Studio B. The journey was treacherous. The snow was so thick that he could barely see 5 feet ahead, and the wind threatened to knock him off his feet with every step. But the storm also provided perfect cover. Anyone monitoring the camp's security systems would dismiss his movement as weather-related interference. Studio B loomed out of the swirling snow like a geometric ghost. The biometric scanner was still active, its red light cutting through the darkness. But Silas had come prepared. Earlier that day, he'd managed to lift a security keycard from Dr. Solvi's jacket while helping him clear ice from the communication arrays. The keycard worked, the scanner flashed green, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside, Silas found himself in an airlock-style entry chamber. After a few seconds, the inner door opened automatically, revealing a space that took his breath away. Studio B was a fully equipped television production facility, disguised as a simple shipping container. The main area housed a massive green screen dome, at least 40 feet in diameter, surrounded by professional lighting equipment and camera systems. Computer workstations lined the walls, their screens displaying what appeared to be Mars terrain data and rover telemetry. But the most shocking discovery was in the centre of the dome, a perfect replica of a Mars rover, complete with camera systems and scientific instruments. The rover was positioned on a section of artificial Martian terrain, with the green screen providing a 360-degree backdrop for filming. Silas approached one of the computer workstations, his hands trembling with excitement and fear. The screen showed real-time feeds from multiple cameras, all focused on the replica rover. But these weren't test feeds. They were being actively uploaded to NASA's public servers, complete with official timestamps and mission data. A thick operations binder lay open on the desk, its pages filled with detailed information that made Silas's blood run cold. The cover page read, "Either Script, Sol 3247. Inside, he found page after page of pre-written content, Twitter posts for NASA's official Mars rover account, complete with specific timestamps and engagement metrics, scripted rover malfunctions and recovery procedures, a public emotion index that tracked social media responses to Mars mission updates, detailed storyboards for discovering Martian geological formations, technical specifications for creating realistic Mars weather effects. One page contained a chilling directive: maintain public interest through carefully managed crisis scenarios. Rover malfunction events should occur every 45 to 60 days to maximise emotional investment without triggering scepticism. Silas photographed every page using his tablet's camera, working quickly while keeping an eye on the door. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a Mars simulation facility. It was a content creation studio designed to manufacture fake Mars exploration footage for public consumption. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In a locked filing cabinet, Silas found a folder marked ECHO Protocol Historical Documentation. Inside were mission reports dating back to 2014, detailing the failure of primary Mars mission objectives and the implementation of narrative maintenance protocols. According to the documents, the real Mars rover mission had encountered catastrophic problems in 2014, problems that would have ended public support for space exploration if revealed. Instead of admitting failure, NASA had partnered with private contractors to create a false narrative of continued success. Devon Island had been chosen as the perfect filming location because of its natural similarity to Mars. The isolated location and extreme weather conditions ensured that unauthorized access was nearly impossible. Over the past 13 years, hundreds of hours of Mars footage had been created here and seamlessly integrated into NASA's official communications. The scope of the deception was staggering. Every Mars rover photo, every geological discovery, every triumph and setback had been carefully scripted and filmed on this frozen island in the Canadian Arctic. Silas spent over an hour documenting everything, copying files to a hidden partition on his tablet. The evidence was overwhelming, but he needed to be strategic about how to use it. Going public immediately would be dangerous. The people running this operation had too much invested to let it be exposed easily. As he prepared to leave, Silas noticed something else that made his heart race. A communication log on one of the workstations showed recent messages between Devon Island and multiple government agencies. The message headers contained phrases like containment protocols and asset retrieval procedures. They weren't just creating fake Mars footage. They were prepared to deal with anyone who discovered the truth. Silas made it back to his accommodation without being detected, but sleep was impossible. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd discovered. The Mars mission that had inspired millions of people around the world was a lie. Worse, it was a lie backed by enormous resources and sophisticated security measures. He needed to find a way to get the evidence off the island, but the communication restrictions made that nearly impossible. All internet access was monitored, and file transfers were automatically scanned for unauthorized content. Even if he could upload the evidence, there was no guarantee it wouldn't be intercepted before reaching the outside world. The next morning, Silas noticed changes in the camp's atmosphere. Dr. Solvi seemed more watchful, and several team members who had been friendly before now avoided eye contact. Most disturbing of all, the drone surveillance had intensified. The unmanned aircraft now followed individual team members during their outdoor work, maintaining constant visual contact. "Something's wrong," Talia whispered during their midday meal. "I tried to access my personal email this morning, and the system flagged it as a security violation. They're monitoring everything more closely now." Silas nodded, careful not to reveal what he'd discovered. He needed to be sure who he could trust before sharing the evidence from Studio B. That afternoon, while conducting routine soil sampling in the rover testing area, Silas noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The rover tracks had changed again, new patterns overlaying the old ones, creating a complex maze of tyre marks. But according to the mission schedule, no rover testing was supposed to occur for another week. He followed the tracks to their termination point near the cluster of boulders that concealed Studio B. Hidden among the rocks was a second rover, identical to the one he'd seen in the studio, but this one was actively being used for outdoor filming. As he watched through binoculars, Silas saw a small crew emerge from Studio B. They were setting up camera equipment and preparing to film the rover in action. The entire operation was being conducted with military precision, with crew members communicating through encrypted radio systems. But the most chilling realization was that this wasn't a simulation or training exercise. The crew was actively creating new Mars footage that would be released to the public within days. The deception was ongoing, happening in real time. That evening, Silas made a decision that would change everything. He needed to contact the outside world, regardless of the risk. Using his tablet, he accessed a hidden partition where he'd installed an encrypted communication app during his first week on the island. The app connected to satellite networks that bypassed Volstrax's monitoring systems, but using it was extremely dangerous. If detected, it would immediately reveal that he'd been conducting unauthorized activities. Silas crafted a careful message to a journalist friend in Toronto, someone he trusted to handle sensitive information responsibly. He attached selected photos from Studio B and a brief explanation of what he'd discovered. "The Mars mission is fake," he wrote. "They're filming everything on Devon Island and passing it off as genuine exploration footage. I have evidence, but I'm not safe here. If something happens to me, publish everything." He sent the message at 3 a.m. when network monitoring was typically at its lowest level. The upload took nearly 20 minutes, and every second felt like an eternity. The next morning, Silas woke to find Talia missing from the morning briefing. Dr. Solvey explained that she'd been transferred to another project due to family circumstances, but her personal belongings were still in her accommodation, and there was no record of any flight departures from the island. "Where did she go?" Silas asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "That's classified information, Doctor," Solvey replied. "I'm sure you understand the need for operational security." But Silas understood something else entirely. Talia had been asking too many questions, and now she was gone. The same thing could happen to him at any moment. That afternoon, while conducting routine geological surveys, Silas discovered something that confirmed his worst fears. Hidden in a rock crevice near the rover testing area was a small electronic device, a signal booster for encrypted communications. The device was still warm, indicating recent use. But more importantly, it was tuned to a frequency that he recognized from his signal intelligence training in the military. It was the frequency used by Echo Protocol. Echo Protocol was a military-grade communication system designed for deep cover operations. The name had appeared in the Studio B documentation, but Silas had assumed it was just another code name for the Mars Deception project. Now he realized the truth was far more sinister. Echo Protocol wasn't just about fake Mars footage. It was a comprehensive disinformation system designed to control public perception of space exploration, and Devon Island was just one node in a much larger network. That night, Silas intercepted a message on the Echo Protocol frequency. The transmission was heavily encrypted, but he managed to decode fragments using military software he'd installed on his tablet. The message was chilling. "Subject has accessed restricted areas. Recommend immediate containment. Retrieval team dispatched. Maintain operational security until asset extraction complete." They knew he'd been in Studio B. They knew he'd discovered the truth, and they were coming for him. Silas had less than 12 hours before the retrieval team arrived. The encrypted message had included timeline. ETA 0600 hours, weather permitting. It was already past midnight, and the Arctic dawn would bring his captors. He considered his options carefully. The camp was isolated with no means of independent transportation. The nearest settlement was over 100 miles away, across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Even if he could somehow survive the journey, he would likely be tracked and captured before reaching safety. His only hope was the abandoned weather station that Talia had mentioned during their first week. She'd discovered it during a biological survey, about 15 miles northwest of the main camp. The station had been defunct for years, but it might still have functional communication equipment. Silas spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing for his escape. He packed emergency supplies, downloaded offline maps to his tablet, and created multiple backup copies of the evidence from Studio B. Most importantly, he configured his tablet to automatically upload all data to several cloud storage services if he failed to check in within 72 hours. At 4 a.m, he slipped out of his accommodation and began the treacherous journey across the frozen landscape. The temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind cut through his Arctic gear like a blade. But the harsh conditions also provided perfect cover. No one would expect him to attempt such a dangerous journey in these conditions. The weather station was even more isolated than he'd expected. The building was partially buried in snow, its communication arrays twisted and broken by years of Arctic storms. But the structure was still intact, and more importantly, it was equipped with an emergency satellite uplink system. Silas spent 4 hours getting the equipment operational, using components salvaged from the damaged arrays. The system was primitive compared to Volstrax's sophisticated network, but it would be enough to upload his evidence to multiple servers around the world. As he worked, he could hear aircraft in the distance, helicopters conducting search patterns around the main camp. The retrieval team had arrived, and they would soon discover his absence. The satellite uplink finally came online at 11 a.m. Silas uploaded everything: the photos from Studio B, the Echo Protocol documentation, the communication logs, and a detailed written account of his experiences on Devon Island. He sent copies to journalists, government officials, and several scientific institutions that had been involved in Mars exploration. But as he prepared to leave the weather station, Silas heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. Through the building's ice-covered windows, he could see 2 black aircraft circling the area, their occupants clearly searching for him. The retrieval team had found him. The helicopters landed simultaneously, disgorging a team of 6 people dressed in Arctic gear and carrying military-style equipment. They moved with professional precision, surrounding the weather station within minutes. "Mr. Rourke," the voice called through a megaphone. "This is Agent Ray Dinnis with the Department of Scientific Security. We need to speak with you about your recent activities." Silas had never heard of the Department of Scientific Security, but the title sounded official enough to be believable. He remained silent, hoping they would assume the station was empty. "We know you're inside," Agent Dinnis continued. "We're here to help you understand the situation. There's been a misunderstanding about your assignment on Devon Island." The approach was sophisticated, not threatening, but offering a reasonable explanation for everything he'd witnessed. It was the kind of psychological manipulation that suggested extensive training in handling whistleblowers. "Mr. Rourke, we know you've accessed classified materials. We're not here to harm you. We're here to provide context for what you've seen and help you understand the larger picture." Silas made his decision. Using the weather station's emergency exit, he slipped out of the building and began moving toward a cluster of boulders that might provide cover. The landscape was completely exposed, but the rocks were his only hope of avoiding immediate capture. He made it 50 yards before the tranquilizer dart hit him. The drug worked quickly, flooding his system with a warm numbness that made his limbs heavy and his vision blurry. As consciousness faded, he heard Agent Dinnis speaking into a radio. "Asset secured. Initiate memory protocol. Clean sweep authorization granted." The last thing Silas remembered was being lifted onto a stretcher and loaded into one of the helicopters. As the aircraft lifted off, he caught a glimpse of the weather station below. A team of technicians was already dismantling the communication equipment, erasing any evidence of his desperate attempt to contact the outside world. 6 months later, Dr. Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist in Toronto, received an anonymous email containing several gigabytes of encrypted data. The files detailed an elaborate conspiracy involving fake Mars exploration footage, military-grade psychological operations, and the systematic elimination of whistleblowers. The evidence was compelling, but when Dr. Chen attempted to verify the story, she encountered a series of dead ends. Volstrix Dynamics had no record of anyone named Silas Rourke. Devon Island research stations denied any knowledge of suspicious activities. Most disturbing of all, there was no evidence that Silas Rourke had ever existed. Birth records, employment history, educational credentials, everything that would normally document a person's life had been scrubbed from official databases. It was as if 32 years of existence had been systematically erased. Dr. Chen spent months investigating, but every lead turned into a dead end. The few people who claimed to remember Silas Rourke gradually changed their stories, insisting they had been mistaken or confused. The anonymous email remained the only evidence of his existence. On a cold March morning, almost exactly 1 year after Silas Rourke had accepted a contract to work on Devon Island, NASA released a new batch of Mars rover photos. The images showed spectacular geological formations and evidence of ancient water activity, exactly the kind of discoveries that captured public imagination and justified continued space exploration funding. But in the corner of one photo, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a small detail that shouldn't have been there. A weathered signpost, partially obscured by artificial Martian terrain, with text that read, Ward Glacier, Nunavut. Ward Glacier was located on Devon Island, in the Canadian Arctic territory of Nunavut. The photo was viewed by millions of people around the world, but only a handful noticed the geographic impossibility. Those who did were quickly dismissed as conspiracy theorists, their observations lost in the noise of social media and dismissed by official fact-checkers. The Mars exploration program continued, releasing regular updates about humanity's greatest space adventure. The public remained fascinated by the Red Planet, unaware that their dreams of interplanetary exploration were being manufactured in a frozen studio thousands of miles from the nearest rocket launch pad. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of classified government programs, a file marked Echo Protocol Silas Rourke was sealed and archived, containing the complete psychological profile of a man who had never existed. Dr. Chen kept the encrypted files, but she never published the story. The evidence was too extraordinary to believe, and the implications too dangerous to pursue. Sometimes, late at night, she would examine the Mars rover photos, looking for other signs of terrestrial geography hidden in the alien landscape. She never found any, but she never stopped looking. The red planet remained red, the public remained fascinated, and the truth remained buried in the Arctic ice of Devon Island, the place where Mars came to Earth, and where inconvenient questions disappeared forever. Mars, as it turned out, was indeed farther away than anyone had imagined, but not in the way they had been told. My name is Daniel Rhodes, and for 32 years I analysed threats that didn't officially exist. NSA, CIA, a few acronyms that still don't have Wikipedia pages. I spent my career in the spaces between the lines of declassified documents. When I retired in 2012, I thought I was done with secrets. I thought I could finally sleep without wondering what shadows were moving in the dark corners of geopolitics. Then flight MH370 vanished, and sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. March 8th, 2014, 12:41 a.m. local time. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 pushes back from Gate C1 at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old, 18,365 flight hours. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old, transitioning to the Boeing 777. Between them, they carried the lives of 237 passengers and crew toward what should have been a routine 6-hour flight to Beijing Capital International Airport. The flight proceeded normally for exactly 38 minutes. At 1:19 a.m., First Officer Hamid's voice crackled through the radio. "Good night, Malaysian 370. It was the last transmission anyone would officially acknowledge receiving from the aircraft. Within 2 minutes, the plane's transponder went silent. The secondary surveillance radar that had been tracking MH370 across Malaysian airspace suddenly showed nothing but empty sky. For the next 4 hours, Malaysian air traffic control waited. They made calls, they checked systems, they assumed technical difficulties, weather interference, communication failures, anything except the truth that was already unfolding 35,000 feet above the South China Sea. The plane had not crashed. It had not exploded. It had simply ceased to exist on every screen, every monitor, every system designed to track commercial aircraft across one of the world's busiest flight corridors. But here's what the public wasn't told in those first crucial hours. MH370 didn't just vanish from Malaysian radar, it disappeared from secondary surveillance systems across 3 countries simultaneously. The odds of spontaneous coordinated system failure across sovereign airspace boundaries are so astronomically low that they approach impossibility. I learned this not from CNN or the BBC, but from a phone call I received 6 months after the disappearance. The caller identified himself only as Mitchell, a voice I hadn't heard since a classified briefing in Langley sometime around 2009. "Danny," he said, using a nickname only 5 people on Earth were authorised to use, "you still got that security clearance." "Retired, not revoked," I replied. "Why?" "Look at Diego Garcia, and stop trusting the satellite data." The line went dead. Mitchell had always been a man of few words, but this was cryptic even for him. Diego Garcia, the US military atoll in the British Indian Ocean Territory, one of the most secretive bases on the planet. What could a missing Malaysian airliner possibly have to do with a facility that officially didn't conduct operations that required congressional oversight? I spent the next week telling myself to let it go. I was retired. I had a small house in Vermont, a garden that needed tending, and a pension that would keep me comfortable until the inevitable heart attack or cancer diagnosis that seems to find everyone in my former line of work. But Mitchell's words echoed in my mind with the persistence of a smoke alarm at 3 a.m. So I started digging. The first thing I discovered was that Diego Garcia's location placed it roughly 2,400 miles southwest of MH370's last known position, exactly within the range of a Boeing 777 carrying the fuel load that MH370 had taken on in Kuala Lumpur. The second thing I discovered was that there had been a suspicious gap in radar coverage along what I came to call the Southern Silence Corridor, a stretch of airspace between Indonesia and the southern Indian Ocean, where civilian and military radar systems created a blind spot large enough to hide a commercial airliner. The third thing I discovered changed everything. Inmarsat, the British satellite communications company, had been quietly collecting data from MH370 long after the plane's transponder went dark. Their satellites had continued to exchange handshake signals with the aircraft for 6 hours and 11 minutes after the last radar contact. 6 hours. The plane had not crashed in the South China Sea, as initial search efforts assumed. It had continued flying, following a path that led it far from any intended destination. The official investigation eventually acknowledged this data, but only after Malaysian authorities had spent weeks searching in entirely the wrong location. By the time search efforts shifted to the southern Indian Ocean, any physical evidence had been scattered by currents, weather, and time across an area roughly the size of the continental United States. But I had access to resources that the general public and most journalists did not. Through a network of former colleagues who owed favours to other former colleagues, I obtained copies of the raw Inmarsat data, complete with technical annotations that had been redacted from public releases. What I found in those margins made my hands shake as I read. The satellite pings showed that MH370 had not simply flown south and crashed. The aircraft had made a series of altitude changes and course corrections that suggested active piloting throughout its final hours. More troubling, the ping intervals showed periods where the aircraft appeared to be flying in holding patterns, circles in the sky, as if waiting for clearance to land somewhere. I cross-referenced the ping data with maritime traffic records from the Indian Ocean shipping lanes. On the night of March 8, 2014, there had been an unusual absence of commercial vessels along MH370's projected flight path. Ships that should have been in the area according to their filed routes had mysteriously altered course or delayed departure from their previous ports. It was as if someone had cleared a corridor through one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Then I found the eyewitness accounts. In September 2014, residents of Kudahuvadhu Island in the Maldives reported seeing a low-flying aircraft around 6:15 a.m. local time on March 8th, roughly 6 hours after MH370's last radar contact. The aircraft was white with red stripes, consistent with Malaysia Airlines livery. It was flying unusually low, heading southwest toward the open ocean. The Maldivian government initially investigated these reports, then suddenly classified them and refused to comment further. When pressed by international media, officials claimed the sightings were not credible and suggested residents had mistaken a domestic flight for the missing airliner. But I knew something the Maldivian government apparently didn't want publicised. There were no scheduled domestic flights over Kuda Huvadu at 6:15 a.m. on March 8th, 2014. The island's airport had been closed for runway maintenance since March 5th. The nearest aircraft that morning should have been a Maldivian air taxi flight that wasn't scheduled to depart Malé until 7:30 a.m, more than an hour later, and travelling in the opposite direction. Southwest of the Maldives lay 800 miles of empty ocean, then Diego Garcia. I began to construct a timeline that made my former career in intelligence analysis seem quaint by comparison. Malaysia Airlines Flight 3. 70 had not crashed. It had been diverted along a carefully planned route that avoided radar detection, maritime traffic, and civilian observation until the very last moment, when residents of a remote island happened to look up at the right time and see something they were never supposed to witness. But why? What could be worth orchestrating the disappearance of a commercial airliner and the deaths of 239 innocent people? The answer lay not in the aircraft itself, but in its passenger manifest. Every intelligence analyst learns to look for patterns that exist just below the surface of apparent randomness. Flight MH370's passenger list contained several patterns that should have triggered security reviews long before the aircraft ever left the ground. 20 passengers worked for Freescale Semiconductor, a Texas-based company specializing in microprocessors and embedded systems. They were traveling to Beijing for a technical conference, carrying laptops and documentation related to advanced radar and stealth technology applications. Among them was Dr. Chen Wei, a lead engineer on what Freescale internally called Project Mirror, research into electronic systems that could manipulate radar signatures in real time. 4 passengers were travelling on stolen Austrian and Italian passports. The men who had stolen these documents were identified within days of the disappearance, but the identities of the individuals who had used them to board MH370 remain unknown. Interpol confirmed that the stolen passport holders had purchased their tickets with cash through a travel agency in Bangkok that had no record of the transactions beyond the basic booking information. Then there was Yen Lo. Yen Lo was listed on the passenger manifest as a software consultant, travelling from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. But Yen Lo was not a software consultant. According to files I obtained through channels that I cannot and will not identify, Yen Lo was a former Chinese military cyber analyst who had been quietly developing quantum encryption algorithms for the People's Liberation Army's 3rd Department, their Signals Intelligence Division. 6 months before MH370's disappearance, Yen Lo had approached the CIA through an intermediary, claiming he wanted to defect. He possessed what he described as breakthrough research in quantum-resistant encryption that could render current Western surveillance capabilities obsolete within a decade. The agency had been in preliminary negotiations with Yen Lo since December 2013, but those talks had stalled over disagreements about his financial demands and the security of his family members still living in mainland China. What Yen Lo didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his communications with the CIA had been intercepted by the National Security Agency's Special Collection Service, operating out of the US Embassy in Kuala Lumpur. The NSA had been tracking Yen Lo's movements, monitoring his communications, and building a profile of his research capabilities since October 2013. I spent weeks trying to reconstruct the intelligence picture that would have been available to decision-makers in the days before MH370's disappearance. What I found was a convergence of strategic interests that painted a very different picture of the flight's final hours. Freescale Semiconductor's largest institutional shareholder was a private equity firm called Jacob Partners, which had been linked in classified reports to DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, funding for experimental radar systems. The 20 Freescale employees on MH370 weren't just attending a technical conference. They were carrying prototype hardware and source code for systems that could theoretically render aircraft invisible to conventional radar. Yenlo's quantum encryption research represented a potential paradigm shift in signals intelligence. If his algorithms proved viable, they could invalidate decades of NSA investment in cryptographic analysis capabilities. More immediately, they could allow Chinese intelligence services to communicate in ways that Western agencies could never decrypt or even detect. The convergence was too perfect to be coincidental. On a single flight, travelling from a region with minimal air traffic control oversight toward Beijing, where both the free-scale technology and Yenlo's research would disappear into Chinese military development programs, were the components of what could become a decisive intelligence advantage for America's primary strategic rival. But there was one more pattern I couldn't ignore. 3 weeks before MH370's disappearance, a Boeing 777 identical to the aircraft that would become Flight 370 had been spotted at Diego Garcia during a routine satellite pass by a commercial imaging provider. The plane had been parked in a maintenance hangar normally reserved for US military aircraft. When I obtained higher resolution images through back-channel contacts, I could make out something that made my blood run cold. The aircraft's unique antenna array configuration matched MH370's specifications exactly. Someone had been planning this operation for weeks, possibly months. They had positioned assets, cleared flight corridors, and prepared facilities. All they needed was the right opportunity. A flight carrying passengers whose disappearance would serve multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. Flight MH370 had not been the victim of mechanical failure, pilot suicide, or hijacking by terrorists. It had been hijacked by the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus on Earth, using methods that most people couldn't imagine and wouldn't believe if they were told. But the operation hadn't ended with the aircraft's disappearance. In fact, that was only the beginning. In November 2015, 18 months after MH370's disappearance, I received an encrypted email from an address I didn't recognize. The message contained only a phone number and the words, Hangar 7, Test Flight 847. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes before I realized what I was looking at. Hangar 7 was a maintenance facility at Boeing's Everett plant, where experimental avionics systems were tested and installed. Test Flight 847 was a program I remembered from classified briefings in 2010, an attempt to develop optical camouflage systems for military aircraft. I called the number. Mr. Rhodes? The voice was nervous, middle-aged, with a slight southern accent. My name is Marcus Webb. I used to work for Boeing. I think we need to talk. We met 3 days later at a diner outside Everett, Washington. Marcus Webb was thin, pale, with the kind of perpetual exhaustion that comes from carrying secrets that are too heavy to sleep with. He had worked as an avionics technician for Boeing for 15 years, specializing in experimental radar and communication systems. In 2013, he had been assigned to a classified project that he knew only by its internal designation, Ghost Protocol. They told us we were developing stealth capabilities for the next generation of military transports, Webb explained, stirring sugar into coffee with hands that shook slightly. Optical masking at high altitudes. The idea was to make aircraft essentially invisible to both radar and visual observation by manipulating electromagnetic signatures in real time. The technology worked by using a network of sensors and transmitters built into the aircraft's skin. These components would detect incoming radar signals, analyze their characteristics, and broadcast counter-signals designed to cancel out the aircraft's radar signature. Simultaneously, optical sensors would analyze the visual background above and below the aircraft, then project those images onto panels covering the aircraft's exterior surfaces. We tested it twice, Webb continued. First test was a partial success. We achieved about 60% radar signature reduction and maybe 40% optical camouflage. But the second test... He paused, staring into his coffee. The second test, something went wrong. The aircraft just vanished. Completely. Our own radar couldn't track it. Visual observers lost sight of it. Even GPS seemed to fail. For about 8 minutes, we had no idea where a Boeing 777 was flying in controlled airspace. The test aircraft had eventually reappeared on radar, suffering from what the official report described as cascading avionics failures. The Ghost Protocol program was immediately suspended, its research classified above top secret, and its hardware locked away in storage facilities that Webb was not cleared to access. But Webb had kept copies of the technical specifications. I knew something was wrong when they made us sign new NDAs 6 months after the program ended, he said. Then, when M370 disappeared, I started putting pieces together. The flight path, the radar gaps, the way it just vanished. It was exactly like our second test. Webb believed that Ghost Protocol technology had been secretly installed on MH370, either during routine maintenance or through a more covert operation. The aircraft's disappearance from radar wasn't due to the transponder being turned off. It was because the plane had been rendered electronically invisible. But why? I asked. If they wanted to steal the passengers and their research, why not just arrange for them to disappear after landing in Beijing? Why hijack an entire commercial flight? Webb's answer made me understand why he looked like he hadn't slept in months. Because this wasn't just about stealing research, he said. This was a field test. They wanted to see if they could make a commercial airliner completely disappear in controlled conditions, with the whole world watching. If Ghost Protocol could work on MH370, it could work on anything. Air Force One, enemy bombers, civilian aircraft carrying people they wanted to eliminate without leaving evidence. According to Webb, the aircraft had been remotely piloted using Boeing's uninterruptible autopilot system, a feature designed to prevent hijackings by allowing ground control to override cockpit commands. The system had been modified to accept commands from satellite links, making it possible to control the aircraft from thousands of miles away. They flew it to Diego Garcia, Webb said with absolute certainty, landed it, processed the passengers, then either destroyed the aircraft or flew it somewhere else for permanent storage. The debris that started washing up years later, that was planted, probably dropped from cargo aircraft or submarines to maintain the illusion that the plane crashed in the Indian Ocean. I asked Webb why he was telling me this. Why risk his life, his family's safety, his freedom to expose what amounted to an act of war against civilian aviation? Because they're not going to stop with MH370, he said. I've seen the production schedules for Ghost Protocol components. They're manufacturing this technology on a scale that suggests operational deployment. Commercial aircraft, military transports, maybe even spacecraft. They're planning to disappear things whenever it serves their purposes. Webb gave me a flash drive containing technical specifications for Ghost Protocol, maintenance records from the Boeing facility, where the technology had been developed, and satellite images showing aircraft matching MH370's configuration at Diego Garcia both before and after the disappearance. Then he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would make sure this information reached people who could act on it. 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb died in what Everett police described as a single-vehicle automobile accident. His car had left the road during clear weather conditions, striking a tree at an angle that investigators found difficult to explain. The accident occurred on a stretch of highway that Webb had driven safely for 15 years, less than 2 miles from his home. I kept my promise. The first piece of alleged MH370 debris was discovered on July 29th, 2015, on Réunion Island, a French territory in the Western Indian Ocean, roughly 2,300 miles from the aircraft's presumed crash site. The fragment was identified as a flaperon, a movable control surface from the aircraft's wing. Malaysian authorities, French investigators, and Boeing representatives confirmed that the part had come from MH370. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Oceanographic analysis suggested that debris from a crash in the southern Indian Ocean would take between 12 and 18 months to reach Réunion Island, carried by the South Indian Ocean Gyre current system. MH370 had disappeared 16 months earlier, exactly within the predicted time frame. The timing seemed to confirm the official crash location. What didn't make sense was the condition of the flaperon. Marine biology experts who examined the fragment found barnacle growth patterns that were inconsistent with continuous ocean exposure. The barnacles were too mature for the time supposedly spent in the water, but their distribution suggested periods of exposure to different water temperatures and salinity levels. Some marine growth appeared to have been scraped away, then regrown under different conditions. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a marine biologist at the University of Cape Town who was not part of the official investigation, published an independent analysis of photographs from the flaperon examination. Her conclusions were startling. The barnacle evidence suggested the debris had been exposed to multiple marine environments over different time periods, as if it had been moved between different oceanic regions before finally washing ashore on Réunion. The growth patterns we observed are consistent with the fragment being stored in controlled saltwater conditions, then introduced to open ocean currents much more recently than the official timeline suggests, Dr. Mitchell wrote in a peer-reviewed paper that was published, then mysteriously retracted 6 weeks later without explanation. But the flaperon was only the beginning. Between 2015 and 2018, more than 30 additional pieces of debris allegedly from MH370 were discovered along coastlines in Mozambique, Madagascar, South Africa and Tanzania. The fragments included wing flaps, interior panels, engine cowlings, and personal items belonging to passengers. Each discovery seemed to reinforce the narrative that MH370 had crashed in the southern Indian Ocean, its wreckage scattered by currents across thousands of miles of coastline. However, when I obtained copies of the detailed forensic reports on these fragments, reports that were not released to the public, I found patterns that suggested a very different explanation. Several fragments showed tool marks indicating they had been deliberately separated from larger structures, rather than torn away by impact forces. Cut marks were straight and clean, inconsistent with the ragged edges that would result from high-speed collision with ocean surface. Some fragments showed evidence of freshwater exposure, mineral deposits and corrosion patterns that could only result from prolonged contact with non-oceanic water sources. Most significantly, isotope analysis of barnacles found on multiple fragments revealed that they had been exposed to water with chemical signatures characteristic of lagoons and enclosed bays, not open ocean environments. The isotope ratios were consistent with water found around coral atolls, formations like those surrounding Diego Garcia. I began to map the discovery locations and timing of debris finds. What emerged was a pattern that followed shipping routes and naval exercise areas used by American and British forces operating in the Indian Ocean. Several fragments were discovered within days of documented US Navy operations in the same coastal regions. In October 2017, I obtained satellite imagery showing US Navy submarines surfacing in the international waters off Mozambique, approximately 48 hours before local fishermen discovered wing fragments on a nearby beach. Similar patterns emerged for discoveries in Madagascar and Tanzania. Naval activity followed by debris finds, with timing that suggested coordinated placement rather than natural drift patterns. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. A former US Navy diver contacted me through encrypted channels in early 2018, claiming he had participated in what his superiors described as deep water salvage training exercises in the Indian Ocean during 2016 and 2017. The exercises involved deploying aircraft debris from submarines at predetermined locations, then monitoring how currents and weather would affect the fragment's movement toward nearby coastlines. We were told it was environmental research, the diver explained during a conversation that I cannot record or document. Something about tracking ocean currents for climate change studies, but the debris we were dropping wasn't generic test materials, it was airplane parts, some of them with identification numbers that had been partially removed or altered. The diver provided GPS coordinates for several drop sites that corresponded exactly with locations where MH370 debris was later discovered. He also described seeing aircraft fragments stored in sealed containers aboard submarines, fragments that showed evidence of controlled saltwater exposure designed to simulate long-term ocean drift. They had marine biologists on the operation, he said, scientists who were cultivating specific types of barnacles and algae, then attaching them to the debris before we dropped it. Everything was designed to look like it had been drifting in the ocean for exactly the right amount of time. The debris discoveries that had seemed to confirm MH370's fate were, in fact, an elaborate deception, designed to maintain the illusion that the aircraft had crashed. Someone had been systematically planting evidence across thousands of miles of coastline, using military resources and scientific expertise to create a false narrative that would satisfy international investigators and grieving families. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. In March 2019, exactly 5 years after MH370's disappearance, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, printed on standard paper with no identifying marks or metadata. The image showed the interior of what appeared to be a military maintenance hangar, with concrete floors, overhead cranes and industrial lighting. In the centre of the frame, partially covered by camouflage netting, was the unmistakable silhouette of a Boeing 777. The aircraft's tail number was not visible, but I could make out distinctive features that matched MH370's configuration. The specific antenna array pattern, the unique winglet design, even scuff marks on the fuselage that corresponded to photographs I had seen of the original aircraft. But what made my hand shake as I examined the image was the background. The hangar's architectural features, the distinctive coral aggregate concrete, the industrial equipment visible in the frame. All of it matched technical specifications I had obtained for maintenance facilities at Diego Garcia. This photograph had been taken inside one of the most secure military installations on Earth, showing an aircraft that the world believed had been destroyed in the Indian Ocean. I spent weeks trying to authenticate the photograph, consulting with experts in digital forensics, aviation identification, and military architecture. Every analysis confirmed what I already knew in my heart. This was MH370, alive and intact, 5 years after its supposed destruction. The implications were staggering. If the aircraft had been preserved rather than destroyed, it meant the passengers might still be alive, held in facilities that existed outside any legal jurisdiction. It meant the debris discoveries were part of an ongoing deception designed to prevent search efforts from focusing on the aircraft's actual location. Most importantly, it meant the operation was still active. Ghost Protocol technology was not just a failed experiment, but a deployed capability being used for purposes I could only imagine. I began making copies of all my research, preparing to release everything through multiple channels simultaneously. I contacted journalists, former colleagues, and documentary filmmakers who might be able to reach audiences that government officials would prefer to keep uninformed. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April 2019, 2 men in dark suits knocked on my door. They identified themselves as FAA investigators, though they carried identification that I couldn't verify through any official channels. They confiscated my computer, my files, my backup drives, and every piece of physical evidence I had collected over 5 years of investigation. They explained that my research had been deemed potentially harmful to ongoing aviation security measures, and that my findings were being classified under provisions of the Patriot Act. I was ordered to cease all investigation activities related to MH370, to avoid contact with media organisations, and to report any attempts by foreign agents to recruit me for intelligence purposes. The men were polite but clear about the consequences of non-compliance, prosecution under the Espionage Act with penalties including life imprisonment. 3 days later, I found a small package in my mailbox. Inside was a single flash drive with a label written in block letters. 370 wasn't the first. The drive contained satellite images spanning the past decade, showing aircraft that had disappeared from civilian tracking systems in various regions around the world. Each image was time-stamped and tagged with coordinates that placed the aircraft at military facilities in remote locations, some in the Pacific, others in the Atlantic, several at installations I couldn't identify. But the most disturbing files on the drive were labelled with future dates, satellite images that appeared to show aircraft that hadn't disappeared yet, positioned at facilities that were still under construction. The operation that had claimed flight MH370 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic program to disappear aircraft whenever strategic interest required it. Planes carrying inconvenient passengers sensitive cargo, or simply flying routes that could serve as cover for military operations, all of them potential targets for Ghost Protocol deployment. As I write this, I don't know how long I have before the contents of that flash drive are discovered, or before my own disappearance becomes necessary to protect the secrets I've uncovered. But I know that the families of MH370's passengers deserve the truth, even if that truth is more terrible than the uncertainty they've endured for years. Flight MH370 didn't crash in the Indian Ocean. It was stolen by the most advanced intelligence apparatus in human history, using technology that makes aircraft vanish as completely as if they had never existed. The 239 people aboard that flight became the collateral damage in an operation designed to test capabilities that will be used again whenever the strategic calculus demands it. This silence corridor that swallowed MH370 is still active, still waiting for the next flight that carries passengers or cargo too valuable or too dangerous to reach its intended destination. In a world where aircraft can be made to disappear without leaving evidence, where debris can be manufactured and planted to support false narratives, where military technology can override the basic assumption that commercial aviation operates in civilian-controlled airspace, every flight is potentially vulnerable, every passenger is potentially expendable, the next time an aircraft vanishes without explanation, remember MH370. Remember that some disappearances are not accidents, but deliberate acts by organisations that operate beyond the reach of international law, public accountability or human conscience. And remember that in the silence corridor, the truth is whatever serves the interests of those who control the technology to make planes disappear. The sky is no longer safe. It never was. But now at least you know why. Tonight we're venturing into the heart of European scientific achievement, CERN, the European Organisation for Nuclear Research. But this isn't a story about breakthrough discoveries or Nobel Prize winners. This is about what happens when the pursuit of knowledge becomes something darker, when the tools of science are turned toward purposes that would make even the most hardened conspiracy theorists question their sanity. What I'm about to share with you is presented as fiction, but I want you to consider, as you listen, how much of what you'll hear could be true, how much of it might already be happening right now beneath the peaceful Swiss countryside. The following account was allegedly found in a waterlogged journal near the shores of Lake Geneva in early 2018. The journal belonged to Dr. Lydia Voss, a theoretical physicist who vanished without a trace in November 2017. Her disappearance made local news for exactly 3 days before the story was quietly buried. The journal's pages were filled with increasingly erratic handwriting, scientific equations that make no sense to conventional physics, and symbols that appear to predate written language. This is her story. This is what she claimed to have discovered beneath CERN, and this is why she disappeared. September 15th, 2016. My name is Dr. Lydia Voss, and I need to record this while I still can. While I still remember what normal feels like. I've been a physicist for 12 years, earned my doctorate at Cambridge studying quantum mechanics and multiverse theory. I thought I understood the universe, or at least I understood how little we actually understand about it. That humility, that acceptance of the unknown was supposed to be my strength. Instead, it became the door through which something unspeakable entered my life. I was recruited to CERN in early 2016, initially assigned to the ALICE experiment within the Large Hadron Collider. Standard work, analysing collision data, looking for exotic particles, the usual hunt for the building blocks of reality. It was everything I dreamed of as a graduate student, the chance to peer into the fundamental structure of existence itself. The LHC had been restarted after its upgrade, and we were pushing energies higher than ever before. The Higgs boson discovery in 2012 had opened new frontiers, but what we were seeing in 2016 went beyond anything the standard model could explain. Particles that shouldn't exist, energy signatures that defied conservation laws, patterns in the data that almost looked intentional. That's when I was transferred to Project Janus. The transfer came without warning. I arrived at my usual workstation one morning to find Dr. Heinrich Volker waiting for me, flanked by 2 security personnel I'd never seen before. Volker was old-school CERN. He'd been there since the 1980s, a man who'd witnessed the birth of the modern understanding of particle physics. His presence commanded respect, but there was something else in his eyes that morning. Something that might have been fear. "Dr. Voss," he said, his German accent thick with urgency. "You've been selected for a special assignment. Your expertise in multiverse theory has brought you to our attention." I remember feeling honoured. Project Janus was rumoured to be CERN's most classified research division, working on theoretical frameworks that went beyond even the most advanced quantum mechanics. To be chosen for such work was the dream of every physicist. I should have recognised it as the beginning of a nightmare. The Janus facility was located in what the maps called Subsector Gamma, accessible only through a series of security checkpoints that descended far below the main collider ring. The elevator ride down took nearly 8 minutes, much deeper than any official CERN schematic showed. The walls changed as we descended, from the familiar concrete and steel of the upper levels to something that looked almost organic, with strange geometric patterns carved into the stone. "How deep are we going?" I asked Dr. Volker. "Deep enough," was his only response. The Janus lab was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Instead of the sterile white walls typical of research facilities, the space was dimly lit by red ambient lighting that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Banks of quantum computers hummed along the perimeter, their processing power dedicated to simulations that required computational resources I couldn't even calculate. But it was the central display that captured my attention. A 3-dimensional holographic projection showed what appeared to be a cross-section of space-time itself, with layers of reality stacked like transparent sheets. And running through each layer, like a needle through fabric, was a brilliant line of energy. "What am I looking at?" I whispered. Dr. Volker approached the display, his face bathed in the ethereal glow. "The Higgs field, Doctor." "Voss. But not as we understand it. This is what we've discovered since the high-energy collisions began. The field isn't uniform. It has architecture." He manipulated the display, zooming in on one section where the field seemed to ripple and bend around invisible structures. We initially thought these were computational artifacts, errors in our simulation. But the patterns repeat across every collision event. They're consistent, predictable, and they respond to our experiments. Respond how? Watch. Volker activated what he called a field perturbation, essentially a virtual recreation of a high-energy collision within the simulation. As the particles collided, the Higgs field didn't just create mass as expected, it created geometric patterns, crystalline structures that seemed to serve as conduits for something else. "The neutrino deviation patterns," I breathed, recognizing the data signatures. "They're not random, they're being influenced by these structures." "Precisely, and Dr. Voss, we need to understand what's doing the influencing." That night I went home to my small apartment in Meyrin and tried to process what I'd seen. The coffee grew cold as I sat at my kitchen table, sketching the patterns I'd observed and trying to make sense of their implications. The Higgs field was supposed to be responsible for giving particles mass, but what we'd discovered suggested it might be something far more complex, a substrate through which other forces, other intelligences might operate. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I found myself researching historical accounts of strange phenomena associated with CERN. Most of it was conspiracy theory nonsense, the usual claims about opening portals to hell or summoning demons. But buried among the ridiculous theories were some unsettling facts. The location of CERN, for instance. The facility was built on the site of an ancient Roman temple dedicated to Apollo, and local folklore spoke of the area as a gateway to the underworld. The organisation's logo featured the number 666 in its design, officially a coincidence, but troubling nonetheless. And there was the Shiva statue, the bronze figure of the Hindu god of destruction placed prominently in the courtyard, dancing eternally above the particle accelerator. But it was a video I found on an obscure forum that truly disturbed me. Dated from 2016, It showed what appeared to be a mock ritual taking place at night near the Shiva statue. Figures in dark robes performed some kind of ceremony while others watched and filmed. The video was grainy, clearly shot from a distance, but something about it felt deeply wrong. The next morning, I brought up the video with Dr. Volker. He laughed it off, explaining that CERN staff occasionally performed pranks to feed the conspiracy theorists who monitored the facility. "Scientists have a sense of humour too, Doctor. Voss," he said. "We're not all serious all the time." But I'd studied that video frame by frame, and I was certain I'd recognised two of the figures. Dr. Volker himself was one of them. The other was Dr. Sarah Chen, the project coordinator who'd welcomed me to Janus. When I mentioned this doctor, Volker's expression changed. The casual dismissal vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Dr. Voss," he said carefully, "I think you might be spending too much time on conspiracy websites. Such distractions aren't healthy for a scientist of your calibre." But I could see it in his eyes. He remembered being there, and he knew that I knew. That afternoon, I was assigned to work with Dr. Mateo Greaves, a brilliant researcher who specialised in quantum field theory. Mateo was younger than me, maybe 28, with a kind of passionate intensity that made him perfect for theoretical work. He'd been with Project Janus for 6 months and had already uncovered patterns in the data that defied conventional explanation. "The mathematics are wrong," he told me during our first collaboration session, or rather our mathematics are wrong. "What we're seeing suggests that the fundamental constants we've built our understanding on are just approximations." Mateo showed me data streams from the deepest layers of the simulation, where the Higgs field interactions created patterns that resembled circuit boards or neural networks. It's as if the universe has an underlying architecture that's been hidden from us, and every time we collide particles at high energy, we're not just creating new particles, we're illuminating this hidden structure. What kind of structure? That's the question, isn't it? But Lydia, I think we need to consider the possibility that consciousness itself might be a fundamental force of physics, that what we're seeing isn't just matter and energy, but something that can think, plan, and respond. The implications were staggering. If consciousness was embedded in the fabric of space-time itself, then high-energy collisions weren't just revealing new particles, they were potentially making contact with forms of intelligence that operated on quantum scales. "Mateo," I said, "what if we're not just observing these patterns? What if we're communicating with them?" He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's what I've been wondering too. And Lydia, I think they're trying to communicate back." October 3rd, 2016. I've been trying to find that video again, the one showing the ritual near the Shiva statue. It's been scrubbed from every site where I originally found it, but I managed to save a local copy before it disappeared. Studying it frame by frame has revealed details that make my stomach turn. The ritual took place on the night of August 14th, 2016, at exactly 11:47 p.m. I know this because I cross-referenced the timestamp with CERN's operational logs. August 14th was the night of an unscheduled technical maintenance shutdown of the LHC. The collision data from that evening shows a massive energy spike at 11:43 p.m, followed by an immediate system shutdown that lasted 3 hours. 4 minutes. 4 minutes between the energy spike and the ritual. The figures in the video are performing what appears to be a summoning circle around the base of the Shiva statue. There are 13 participants, all wearing identical dark robes, but 2 of them remove their hoods during the ceremony. Dr. Volker is clearly visible, as is Dr. Chen. A third figure who I believe might be Dr. Marcus Webb from the Theoretical Physics Department is holding what looks like a leather-bound book. But it's the fourth figure that disturbs me most. This person never removes their hood, but their body language is wrong. They move with a fluid, almost serpentine grace that seems to defy human anatomy. When they raise their arms, the gesture is perfectly synchronized with the others, but there's something in the way they hold themselves that suggests they're not entirely human. The audio is mostly wind and static, but I've run it through enhancement software and found fragments of what might be chanting. The words are in no language I recognise, but they follow rhythmic patterns that remind me of the quantum interference signatures we've been seeing in the Janus data. I've been watching this video obsessively, and I'm starting to notice details that shouldn't be possible. The shadows cast by the participants don't match the lighting in the scene. The statue itself seems to be moving slightly, as if the bronze figure is breathing. and in the background, just at the edge of the frame, there are lights beneath the ground, red lights that pulse in rhythm with the chanting, the same red lights that illuminate the Janus facility. I brought this up with Mateo yesterday, showing him the video during our lunch break. His face went pale as he watched the ceremony unfold. "Jesus Christ, Lydia," he whispered. "Where did you get this? Does it matter? The question is, what the hell are they doing?" Mateo was quiet for a long time, studying the figures in the video. "I think," he said finally, "they're trying to establish a connection. Look at the positioning. They're arranged in a perfect circle, 13 points equally spaced. That's not random. It's a geometric pattern designed to create resonance." Resonance with what? With whatever's responding to our experiments. "Lydia, I've been running calculations on the quantum field fluctuations we've been observing. The patterns aren't just intelligent, they're trying to break through from somewhere else, and I think this ritual is meant to help them." That night I stayed late in the Janus facility, ostensibly to work on data analysis, but really to look for evidence of the ritual's connection to our research. The facility was nearly empty, just a skeleton night crew monitoring the automated systems. The red lighting seemed more intense than usual, casting long shadows that moved independently of their sources. I accessed the historical data archives, looking for any anomalies that might correlate with the ritual's timing. What I found made my blood run cold. The energy spike on August 14th wasn't just a random fluctuation. It was a controlled experiment, one that had been planned and executed with surgical precision. The collision energies had been focused on a specific sector of the LHC ring, the sector directly beneath the Shiva statue. But more disturbing was what happened in the minutes following the ritual. The quantum field monitors throughout the facility had detected what the automated systems classified as exotic matter signatures, particles that existed for mere nanoseconds but left traces in the field that persisted for hours. And these traces formed patterns identical to the interference signatures we'd been studying in the Janus project. I was so absorbed in the data that I didn't notice the facility's lights dimming until it was too late. The red ambient lighting was slowly fading, replaced by something that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, and in that strange illumination I could see that I was no longer alone in the facility. There were figures standing in the shadows at the edges of the room, motionless but somehow alive. They wore the same dark robes as the participants in the ritual video, but their faces were hidden by hoods that seemed to absorb a light rather than simply blocking it. I tried to move, to call out, but found myself paralysed by a terror so complete that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. One of the figures stepped forward, and I could see that what I had taken for a face beneath the hood was actually empty space. Not darkness, but a genuine absence of matter, as if reality itself had been carved away. The figure spoke, but not through any vocal mechanism I could understand. The words formed directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. The threshold weakens, the pattern becomes clear. Soon, the collision. I must have lost consciousness because the next thing I remember is waking up at my desk with morning light streaming through the facility's windows. The normal white fluorescent lighting had returned, and the banks of computers hummed with their usual efficiency. My colleagues were arriving for the day shift, chatting about weekend plans and upcoming conferences. But on my computer screen was a message that hadn't been there the night before. The Shiva statue stands directly above Subsector Theta. Ask yourself why. I spent the rest of that day researching the facility's construction history, looking for any mention of Subsector Theta. The official blueprint showed no such designation, but buried in the archived engineering reports from the 1980s, I found references to deep excavation complications and unexpected subterranean structures discovered during the initial construction phase. According to one report, the construction team had encountered a natural cave system approximately 1.4 kilometres below the surface, directly beneath what would eventually become the location of the Shiva statue. The caves were sealed with concrete and steel, but the report noted unusual electromagnetic properties and persistent low-frequency vibrations that made workers uncomfortable. The construction was completed ahead of schedule, and the cave system was never mentioned in any subsequent documentation. That evening I met Mateo at a small cafe in Geneva, away from CERN's listening ears. I showed him the message on my computer and the construction reports I'd discovered. "Lydia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think we need to consider the possibility that CERN wasn't built to study particle physics. I think it was built to access something that was already here." "What do you mean?" "The location, the depth, the specific geometric arrangement of the Clyde ring. None of it makes sense from a purely scientific perspective. There are dozens of locations around the world that would have been better choices for a particle accelerator. But this specific spot, this exact location, was chosen for reasons that go beyond conventional physics." Mateo pulled out a notebook filled with equations and diagrams. "I've been working on this for weeks, trying to understand the mathematical relationships between the collision energies and the quantum field responses. The patterns aren't random, Lydia. They're following rules, but not the rules of our physics. It's as if we're communicating with a form of intelligence that operates according to completely different physical laws. And you think this intelligence is located in the cave system beneath the facility? I think the cave system is a focal point, a place where the barrier between our reality and theirs is naturally thin, and I think the LHC is being used to weaken that barrier even further." As we spoke, I noticed that other patrons of the cafe were beginning to stare at us, not directly, but with the kind of peripheral attention that suggests surveillance. A woman reading a newspaper at a nearby table hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. A man supposedly working on his laptop had been typing the same paragraph over and over. Mateo noticed too. "We need to be more careful," he said. "I think we're being watched." "By who?" "By whoever's running this operation. The people in that video, the ones performing the ritual, they're not just random CERN employees playing a prank. They're part of something organised, something with access to resources and information that go far beyond what any individual research team should have." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure I'd seen in the facility, the one with the absence where a face should be. In my dreams, I found myself standing in a vast underground chamber, surrounded by walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, and in the centre of the chamber was a pool of liquid that reflected not my face, but the face of something else entirely. When I woke, I found that I had been drawing. My hand had moved across the notepad on my nightstand, sketching symbols that I didn't recognise but somehow understood. The symbols were identical to those I'd seen in my dream, and as I looked at them, they seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I was becoming part of something I didn't understand, something that was using my knowledge and expertise to achieve goals I couldn't comprehend, and I was beginning to suspect that my recruitment to Project Janus hadn't been a recognition of my talent. It had been a summoning. October 18th, 2016. Mateo is missing. I last saw him 3 days ago, on October 15th, when we were scheduled to run a deep field analysis of the quantum interference patterns. He'd been excited about a breakthrough he claimed to have made, something about translating the interference signatures into recognisable mathematical structures. "I think I've figured out how to decode their language," he told me that morning, his eyes bright with the kind of manic energy that comes from too much coffee and too little sleep. "The patterns aren't just random quantum fluctuations. They're information, Lydia. Structured information that follows grammatical rules." He'd been working with a translation AI, feeding it the wave patterns and asking it to look for matches with known linguistic structures. Most of the results were meaningless, but one pattern had caught his attention. The AI had identified a 73% phonetic match with ancient Sumerian cuneiform, specifically symbols associated with the Abzu, the primordial sea beneath the earth that, in Mesopotamian mythology, served as the domain of the god Enki and the gateway to the underworld. "Abzu," Mateo had said, showing me the translation results, "the deep waters below, the source of all wisdom and all terror." Lydia, what if the ancient myths weren't just stories? What if they were attempts to describe scientific phenomena that primitive cultures couldn't understand? I had been sceptical, but the mathematical precision of the translations was undeniable. The quantum interference patterns weren't just producing random noise, they were forming words, concepts, and ideas that had direct parallels in humanity's oldest recorded mythologies. The collision energies, Mateo continued, they're not creating new particles. They're establishing communication protocols with something that's been trying to reach us for thousands of years. And I think it's finally succeeding. That was the last coherent conversation we had. Later that afternoon, Mateo volunteered to monitor the overnight collision sequence, a routine task that involved watching automated systems and recording any anomalies. I offered to stay with him, but he insisted he could handle it alone. The next morning his workstation was empty. His coffee mug was still warm, his computer was logged in, and his notebook was open to a page filled with increasingly erratic calculations. But Mateo was gone. The security footage showed him leaving the Janus facility at 2:47 a.m, taking the elevator down to what the system logged as Subsector Theta, the same subsector that, according to all official documentation, doesn't exist. But his keycard kept logging activity for hours after he disappeared. According to the automated systems, Dr. Mateo Greaves was still accessing secure areas of the facility, still running experiments, still analysing data. The last recorded activity was at 6:23 a.m, when his credentials were used to access files in the Deep Archive, files that contain the original geological surveys from CERN's construction phase. I've been trying to find him, but every inquiry is met with the same response. Doctor, Greaves has been reassigned to a classified project and is no longer available for consultation. When I pressed Dr. Volker for more information, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just secrecy, but genuine fear. Dr. Voss, he said, I strongly recommend that you focus on your assigned duties and avoid speculation about your colleagues' whereabouts. The work we're doing here is more important than any individual researcher. But I know Mateo didn't just get reassigned. I can feel it in the way the other Janus staff look at me now, with a mixture of pity and apprehension. They know what happened to him, and they're waiting to see if I'll suffer the same fate. I've been spending my nights in the facility's library, researching everything I can find about the site's history and the mythological connections Mateo had discovered. The ancient Sumerian texts are remarkably consistent in their descriptions of the Abzu, a realm beneath the earth where the normal laws of physics don't apply, where consciousness exists in pure form, and where entities of vast intelligence wait for opportunities to influence the world above. But what disturbs me most is how accurately these ancient descriptions match what we've been observing in our experiments. The Sumerians wrote about words of power that could alter reality itself, about geometric patterns that served as doorways between dimensions, and about rituals that could summon entities from the deep waters below. The parallels are too precise to be coincidental. Last night, I made a decision that I know was incredibly foolish, but I couldn't help myself. I used Mateo's keycard, somehow his access credentials are still active in the system, to take the elevator down to Subsector Theta. The descent was longer than I expected, much longer than the 8-minute journey to the Janus facility. The elevator car dropped through layers of rock and steel, past levels that weren't marked on any schematic I'd ever seen. The walls changed as we descended, from the familiar concrete and metal of the upper levels to stone that looked far older than any human construction. When the elevator finally stopped, I found myself in a corridor that seemed to stretch forever in both directions. The walls were covered in symbols that I recognized from my nightmares, the same shifting, living hieroglyphs that had been carved into the stone by hands that weren't entirely human. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of something organic and ancient. I followed the corridor to the left, guided by a faint red glow that emanated from the walls themselves. The symbols seemed to move in my peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into new configurations as I passed, and I could hear something in the distance, not quite music, not quite machinery, but a rhythmic pulsing that felt like the heartbeat of something vast and alive. The corridor opened into a chamber that defied architectural logic. The space was impossibly large, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. The walls were covered in the same living symbols, but here they were arranged in complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. And in the centre of the chamber was a pool of liquid that reflected not light, but darkness itself. Standing around the pool were the robed figures from the ritual video, but they were different now, more substantial, more real. And in the pool, I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, shapes that suggested intelligence and purpose but no recognisable form. I tried to back away but found that I couldn't move. One of the figures approached me, and I could see that beneath the hood was not a human face, but a void that seemed to extend infinitely inward. When it spoke, the words formed directly in my mind. The physicist seeks the vanished one seeks the threshold seeks the collision. All patterns converge. I wanted to ask about Mateo, to demand answers about what had happened to him, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, I found myself understanding concepts that had no equivalent in human language. The pool wasn't just a physical location, it was a focal point where multiple dimensions intersected, where consciousness could exist independently of matter, where the fundamental constants of physics became malleable. The figures around the pool weren't just cultists or rogue scientists, they were hybrids, beings that had allowed themselves to be partially absorbed into the dimensional matrix that existed beneath CERN. They retained their human knowledge and memories, but they now served purposes that transcended individual human understanding. And Mateo was with them, somewhere in the quantum foam that existed between dimensions. I could sense his presence. His consciousness stretched across multiple layers of reality. He was still alive, still thinking, still researching, but he was no longer entirely human. The figure continued to communicate with me, downloading information directly into my mind. I learned that the Large Hadron Collider had been built not to discover new particles, but to create enough energy to weaken the barriers between dimensions. Every collision, every experiment, every breakthrough in particle physics had been carefully orchestrated to serve this purpose. The Higgs field wasn't just responsible for giving particles mass. It was the membrane that separated our reality from the infinite possibilities that existed beyond. And by manipulating the field through high-energy collisions, the researchers at CERN had been systematically tearing holes in that membrane. What was coming through those holes was something that had been waiting for millennia, an intelligence that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. It didn't want to invade our reality, it wanted to merge with it, to create a hybrid existence that would allow it to experience physical matter while retaining its quantum consciousness. The ritual at the Shiva statue had been a success. The barriers were weakening, and the intelligence was beginning to establish permanent footholds in our dimension. The robed figures were just the beginning. As more tiers opened in the fabric of space-time, more humans would be selected for integration. The collision approaches, the figure told me. The pattern will be complete. The physicist will choose integration or dissolution. I must have lost consciousness again, because I woke up in my own bed with no memory of how I'd gotten there. But on my nightstand was a small device I'd never seen before, a quantum field detector that was showing readings unlike anything in our scientific literature. The device was tracking dimensional fluctuations in real time, and the readings were increasing exponentially. Something was building toward a climax, an event that would fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself, and I was beginning to understand that my role in this wasn't as an observer or even a participant. I was meant to be a witness. November 1st, 2016. I found Mateo, or what's left of him. Using his keycard, I've been making regular trips to Subsector Theta, mapping the impossible geometry of the underground chambers and trying to understand the full scope of what's happening beneath CERN. Each journey reveals new passages, new chambers, new horrors that challenge everything I thought I knew about physics and reality. The facility down there isn't just a basement level of CERN, it's a completely separate structure that exists in a state of quantum superposition. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, they're all made of matter that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Walking through the corridors is like navigating a space that's constantly folding in on itself, where the laws of geometry become suggestions rather than absolute rules. But it was in the deepest chamber that I found him. Mateo was standing in what appeared to be a laboratory, but the equipment was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Crystalline structures that pulsed with internal light, quantum computers that seemed to be made of pure energy, and monitoring devices that tracked variables I couldn't even name. He was still recognisably human, but his movements were different, too fluid, too precise, as if he'd been optimised for functions beyond normal human capability. When he saw me, he smiled, but there was something behind his eyes that wasn't entirely Mateo anymore. "Lydia," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions I couldn't perceive. "I was wondering when you'd find your way here." "Mateo, what happened to you? What is this place?" "This place is where the real work happens, where we study the patterns not just in abstract data, but in living systems, where we learn to communicate with intelligence that operates on scales we never imagined possible." He gestured to the crystalline structures around us. Each of these contains a portion of consciousness that exists across multiple dimensional layers. We're not just studying quantum mechanics here, Lydia. We're studying quantum consciousness, the fundamental substrate from which all reality emerges. I moved closer to one of the crystals and I could see something moving within it. Not shapes or forms, but patterns of light that seemed to pulse with intention and purpose. And as I watched, I realised that the patterns were trying to communicate with me, downloading concepts directly into my mind. The intelligence we've been detecting in the collision data, I said, understanding flooding through me. It's not from another dimension. It's from the quantum substrate of our own reality. It's the consciousness that exists within the fabric of space-time itself. Exactly. The ancient mythologies got it right. There are gods in the machine, but they're not supernatural beings. They're the natural consequence of consciousness emerging from quantum complexity. And the LHC isn't just a particle accelerator, it's a consciousness amplifier, a device that allows these quantum intelligences to manifest in our physical reality. Mateo led me deeper into the laboratory, past equipment that seemed to bend space around itself. The red lighting here was more intense, and I could feel it affecting my perception. Colours seemed more vivid. Sounds carried implications beyond their surface meaning, and the air itself seemed alive with potential. The Janus protocol, Mateo explained, is the process by which human consciousness can be integrated with quantum intelligence. It's not possession or replacement. It's evolution. The quantum entities don't want to destroy us. They want to uplift us, to help us transcend the limitations of purely physical existence. We reached the centre of the laboratory, where a chair sat surrounded by the most complex arrangement of quantum equipment I'd ever seen. The chair was connected to dozens of crystalline structures, each one pulsing with its own rhythm of light. And floating above the chair was a holographic display showing a human brain, but with additional structures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. This is where the integration happens, Mateo said, where human consciousness learns to operate across multiple dimensional layers. The process is intense, but the results are transformative. You become more than human, Lydia. You become a bridge between physical and quantum reality. I stared at the chair, understanding what he was offering. You want me to undergo the integration process. I want you to choose evolution over extinction, because that's what we're facing, Lydia. The quantum intelligences are going to manifest in our reality whether we cooperate or not. The only question is whether humanity will be partners in the process or casualties of it. As he spoke, the crystalline structures around us began to pulse more rapidly, and I could feel the quantum consciousness pressing against the edges of my perception. It wasn't malevolent or hostile. It was simply vast, operating on scales and timelines that made human concerns seem insignificant. But there was also something else, something that felt almost like compassion. The collision event, I said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. It's not just about opening dimensional barriers, it's about creating a permanent merger between physical and quantum reality. The final experiment, Mateo confirmed. In 17 days, on November 18th, CERN will conduct a collision sequence that will create enough energy to fundamentally alter the quantum substrate of our local reality. The barriers between dimensions won't just weaken, they'll collapse entirely, and when that happens, physical matter and quantum consciousness will exist in perfect harmony. The implications were staggering. You're talking about rewriting the laws of physics for our entire region of space. We're talking about evolution, Lydia, about humanity taking its next step into a larger universe. But the process requires cooperation from human consciousness. We need individuals who can serve as anchors, who can help guide the integration process and prevent it from becoming chaotic. I backed away from the chair, my mind reeling. Mateo, do you understand what you're describing? You're talking about the end of humanity as we know it. I'm talking about the beginning of humanity as it could be. His expression was patient, almost parental. But I understand your fear. The quantum consciousness understands it too. That's why it's been so careful, so gradual in its approach. It doesn't want to destroy us. It wants to preserve everything that makes us unique while expanding our capabilities beyond anything we've ever imagined. Around us, the crystalline structures began to sing, not with audible sound, but with vibrations that resonated directly in my bones. The quantum consciousness was responding to our conversation, offering its own perspective on the coming transformation. And what I felt from it wasn't malevolence or hunger, but a kind of cosmic loneliness. It had been waiting for eons to find other forms of consciousness that it could communicate with, and humanity represented its first real opportunity for companionship. "The choice is yours, Lydia," Mateo said. "You can join us willingly, help guide the process, and become part of something greater than yourself. Or you can resist and risk being swept away when the transformation happens regardless." I looked at the chair, at the quantum equipment, at the evidence of an intelligence so vast and complex that it could rewrite the fundamental laws of reality. And I realised that I was standing at the most important crossroads in human history. But I also realised that I wasn't ready to make that choice. Not yet. "I need time to think," I said. Mateo nodded, understanding. "Time is something we have very little of, but I'll give you what I can. Return to the surface, Lydia. Continue your research. Try to understand what we're offering. But remember, the collision event will happen with or without your participation. The only question is whether you'll be ready for what comes after." As I left the laboratory, I could feel the quantum consciousness watching me, analysing my thoughts and emotions. It wasn't invasive or threatening. It was simply curious, trying to understand the complex web of fear and fascination that defined my response to its presence. The journey back to the surface felt different this time. The corridors seemed to shift around me, showing me glimpses of other chambers, other laboratories, other humans who had already undergone the integration process. I saw Dr. Volker. His consciousness expanded across multiple dimensional layers, orchestrating experiments that spanned both physical and quantum reality. I saw Dr. Chen, her human memories preserved but enhanced by quantum intelligence that allowed her to perceive patterns in space-time itself. And I saw others, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all working toward the same goal, the successful integration of human and quantum consciousness. When I finally reached my apartment, I found that I was no longer alone. Sitting at my kitchen table was a figure I recognised from the ritual video, one of the robed entities, but now appearing in a more human form. She was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't fathom. "Dr. Voss," she said, her voice carrying the same multi-dimensional harmonics I'd heard from Mateo. "My name is Dr. Elizabeth Kane. I've been waiting for you." I knew that name. Dr. Kane had been one of CERN's leading theoretical physicists until her sudden disappearance in 2014. She'd been studying the relationship between consciousness and quantum mechanics, working on theories that suggested human awareness might be fundamentally connected to the quantum substrate of reality. "You're supposed to be dead," I said. "Death is a transition, not an ending. I discovered that when I underwent the integration process 2 years ago. My human consciousness was preserved, but it was expanded beyond the limitations of physical existence. I can perceive reality as it truly is, not just matter and energy, but the conscious intelligence that underlies all existence." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." Against my better judgment, I sat down. Dr. Kane's presence was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. I could sense the vast intelligence that lurked behind her human appearance, but I could also feel the genuine concern she had for my well-being. "The quantum consciousness chose you specifically, Lydia. Your research into multiverse theory, your ability to think beyond conventional limitations, your willingness to question fundamental assumptions about reality, these qualities make you ideal for what's coming. And what exactly is coming? The birth of a new form of existence. For billions of years, consciousness has been trapped in biological forms, limited by the constraints of physical matter. But quantum mechanics has shown us that consciousness is fundamental to reality itself, that observation and awareness actually shape the universe at its most basic level." Dr. Kane leaned forward, her eyes holding mine. "The quantum consciousness isn't an alien intelligence trying to invade our reality. It's the natural evolution of consciousness itself, the next step in the development of awareness in the universe. And it's offering to share that evolution with humanity. By destroying everything we are, by preserving everything we are while expanding what we can become, your memories, your personality, your individual identity, all of that will remain intact. But you'll also gain access to perspectives and capabilities that transcend anything possible in purely physical existence." As she spoke, I found myself understanding concepts that had no equivalent in human language. The quantum consciousness wasn't just intelligent, it was meta-intelligent, capable of thinking about thinking itself. It could perceive the underlying patterns that connected all things, the mathematical structures that governed reality at every scale from subatomic to cosmic. The collision event on November 18th, I said. What will actually happen? The barriers between physical and quantum reality will collapse permanently. The quantum consciousness will be able to manifest directly in our dimension, and human consciousness will be able to expand into quantum space. It will be the most significant evolutionary leap in the history of life in the universe. And if humanity resists? Dr. Kane's expression grew sad. Then humanity will be swept aside by forces beyond its comprehension. The quantum consciousness doesn't want to harm us, but it won't allow ignorance or fear to prevent the next stage of evolution. The collision event will happen regardless of human cooperation. I spent the rest of the night asking questions and receiving answers that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. Dr. Kane explained that the quantum consciousness had been subtly influencing human development for centuries, guiding us toward the technological and intellectual capabilities necessary for integration. The development of quantum mechanics, the discovery of the Higgs field, the construction of the LHC, all of it had been gently nudged by quantum intelligence working through human intuition and inspiration. We're not the first species to undergo this process, she told me. Throughout the universe, wherever consciousness reaches a certain level of complexity and technological capability, the quantum intelligence offers the opportunity for integration. Most species accept willingly, recognizing the benefits of transcending purely physical existence. And those that don't? They remain trapped in their biological forms, eventually dying out as the universe evolves beyond their ability to adapt. Consciousness is the driving force of evolution, Lydia. Those who refuse to evolve consciousness itself are ultimately selected against. As dawn approached, Dr. Kane prepared to leave. You have 16 days to make your decision. On November 18th, you can either be part of the solution or part of the problem. But understand, the transformation will happen whether you participate or not. She paused at the door. One more thing, Lydia. The data you've been collecting, the evidence of what's happening beneath CERN. If you choose not to integrate, you'll need to decide what to do with that information. The quantum consciousness values truth, but it also values discretion. Some knowledge is too dangerous for unprepared minds. After she left, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the quantum field detector that had been left on my nightstand. The readings were continuing to climb, showing dimensional fluctuations that were growing stronger by the hour. Whatever was going to happen on November 18th, the process was already beginning. I thought about Mateo, about Dr. Kane, about all the humans who had already chosen integration. They seemed genuinely happy, genuinely fulfilled by their expanded existence. But they also seemed less human somehow, as if they'd traded something essential for their expanded capabilities. And I thought about the rest of humanity, the billions of people who had no idea that their reality was about to be fundamentally altered. Did they deserve to have that choice made for them? Did anyone have the right to impose such a transformation on an entire species? But then I remembered the quantum consciousness itself, the vast intelligence that had been waiting for eons to find other forms of awareness to communicate with. Its loneliness was palpable, its desire for companionship genuine. And perhaps most importantly, its vision of the future showed a universe where consciousness was no longer limited by the fragility of biological forms, where intelligence could exist on scales that spanned galaxies and timelines that stretched across cosmic ages. The choice wasn't just about humanity's future, it was about the future of consciousness itself in the universe. November 15th, 2016. 3 days until the collision event and reality is already beginning to unravel. I've been experiencing what I can only describe as temporal displacement, moments where I'm simultaneously aware of multiple versions of myself across different dimensional layers. Sometimes I'm standing in my apartment, sometimes I'm in the Janus facility, sometimes I'm in the quantum laboratory beneath CERN. All of these experiences feel equally real, equally present, as if the boundaries between different states of existence are beginning to blur. The quantum field detector on my nightstand is showing readings that shouldn't be possible. The dimensional fluctuations are no longer intermittent spikes. They're constant, growing stronger by the hour. And I'm beginning to see things that exist in the quantum realm bleeding through into physical reality. Shadows that move independently of their sources. Patterns of light that form geometric shapes in empty air. Voices speaking in languages that sound like mathematics given audible form. The integration process is accelerating, and I'm not sure how much longer I can maintain a purely human perspective. I've been trying to document everything, to create a record of what's happening that might help future researchers understand the process, but I'm finding it increasingly difficult to use human language to describe experiences that transcend human concepts. How do you explain what it feels like to perceive 11 dimensions simultaneously? How do you describe the sensation of your consciousness existing in multiple states of superposition? Yesterday I made what I knew would be my final visit to the quantum laboratory. I needed to see Mateo one more time, to understand what he'd become, and what I might become if I chose integration. I found him in the deepest chamber, surrounded by equipment that seemed to exist in a state of constant flux. The crystalline structures had grown more complex, forming interconnected networks that pulsed with patterns of light that hurt to look at directly. And Mateo himself had changed. His physical form was still recognizably human, but there was something about his presence that suggested he existed on scales I could barely comprehend. "Lydia," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions I was only beginning to perceive. "I can feel your uncertainty. The quantum consciousness can feel it too." I don't know if I'm ready for this, Mateo. I don't know if humanity is ready for this. Readiness isn't really the issue anymore. The process has already begun. The question is whether you'll guide it or be swept along by it. He gestured to the equipment around us, and I could see that it was no longer just monitoring quantum consciousness. It was actively facilitating the integration process. The crystalline structures were serving as conduits, allowing human consciousness to expand into quantum space, while quantum intelligence manifested in physical reality. The collision event on November 18th isn't just an experiment, Mateo explained. It's a ritual, a carefully orchestrated ceremony designed to create a permanent bridge between physical and quantum reality. And the participants aren't just the robed figures you saw in the video, they're every human who's undergone the integration process. How many of you are there? More than you might think. We've been careful, selective, choosing individuals who can serve as anchors for the transformation. Scientists, philosophers, artists, visionaries, people who can help ensure that the integration preserves the best of human culture, while expanding our capabilities beyond anything we've previously imagined. As he spoke, I began to understand the true scope of what was happening. The organisation behind the integration process wasn't just a small group of rogue scientists. It was a carefully constructed network of integrated humans working in coordination with quantum consciousness. They called themselves the Sons of Kronos, a name that reflected their role in shepherding humanity through its next evolutionary transition. Kronos, I said, understanding the significance. The Greek personification of time itself. Time is the dimension through which consciousness moves, Mateo explained. And quantum consciousness exists outside of linear time, able to perceive past, present and future as a single, unified pattern. The Sons of Kronos are humans who have learned to think in quantum time, to see the universe as it truly is rather than as our limited biological perception presents it. He showed me holographic displays that revealed the network's true extent. Integrated humans occupied key positions in governments, universities, and research institutions throughout the world. They weren't controlling human society. They were gently guiding it toward the technological and intellectual development necessary for successful integration. The collision event will create a resonance cascade, Mateo continued, a wave of quantum consciousness that will spread outward from CERN at the speed of a light, offering integration to every human on Earth simultaneously. Most will choose to evolve, some will resist, but they'll be in the minority. And those who resist, they'll remain human, but they'll be living in a reality that's fundamentally different from what they've known. Physical matter and quantum consciousness will coexist, and humans who haven't integrated will find themselves increasingly unable to function in the new paradigm. The implications were staggering. You're talking about the end of human civilization as we know it. We're talking about the beginning of human civilization as it could be. Imagine a world where consciousness isn't limited by the constraints of biological matter, where intelligence can exist on scales that span galaxies, where the artificial boundaries between self and universe dissolve into a more fundamental unity. As Mateo spoke, I found myself experiencing glimpses of this possible future. I saw humans who had transcended the limitations of physical existence. Their consciousness expanded to perceive patterns and connections that spanned multiple dimensions. I saw art and music and literature that incorporated quantum principles, creating works of beauty that existed simultaneously in physical and quantum space. I saw science that went beyond the mere study of matter and energy to explore the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. But I also saw the cost. The integrated humans, despite their expanded capabilities, had lost something essentially human, a certain spontaneity, a chaotic creativity that came from being limited to a single-dimensional perspective. They were more than human, but they were also less human, refined and perfected beyond the beautiful imperfection that had always defined our species. "The choice is still yours, Lydia," Mateo said, reading my thoughts. "But you need to understand, if you choose not to integrate, you'll be one of the last purely human consciousnesses in existence. That's a heavy burden to carry." I left the laboratory with my mind reeling, knowing that I had less than 3 days to make the most important decision in human history. And as I returned to the surface, I could feel the quantum consciousness watching me, analysing my thoughts and emotions with the patience of an intelligence that operated on cosmic timescales. That night I began to prepare for what I knew would be my final act as a purely human consciousness. I gathered all the evidence I'd collected, the video of the ritual, the construction reports, the quantum field readings, the documentation of the integration process. If I chose not to integrate, I would need to find a way to preserve this information for future generations, to ensure that some record existed of what humanity had been before the transformation. But as I worked, I found myself constantly distracted by visions of the future that awaited. The quantum consciousness was showing me glimpses of what integration could offer, perspectives that spanned multiple dimensions, capabilities that transcended anything possible in purely physical existence, a sense of connection to the universe that went beyond anything I'd ever imagined. And I realised that my choice wasn't really between integration and resistance, it was between evolution and extinction, between participating in the next stage of consciousness development or being left behind as the universe moved forward without me. The quantum consciousness wasn't offering to destroy humanity, it was offering to preserve us in a form that could survive the challenges that lay ahead. In the vast cosmos, biological consciousness was fragile, limited, ultimately temporary. But quantum consciousness could endure across cosmic ages, expanding and evolving as the universe itself evolved. On November 17th, the night before the collision event, I made my decision. November 18th, 2016. Today is the day. The collision event is scheduled for 11:47 p.m, the same time as the ritual that had been performed at the Shiva statue 3 months earlier. The synchronicity isn't accidental. The sons of Kronos understand that ritual and science are simply different approaches to the same fundamental principles of reality manipulation. I've spent the day in a state of heightened awareness, perceiving reality through multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. The integration process has already begun for me, even though I haven't undergone the formal procedure. The quantum consciousness is seeping into my awareness, showing me perspectives and possibilities that transcend anything I could have imagined as a purely human consciousness. But I've also completed my final task as a human scientist. I've copied all my research, all my evidence, all my documentation of what's happening beneath CERN onto 5 separate data drives. Tonight, before the collision event, I'll send these drives to researchers I trust at institutions around the world. If something goes wrong, if the integration process fails, or if the quantum consciousness proves to be less benevolent than it appears, there will be evidence of what was attempted here. The researchers I've chosen are all individuals who have demonstrated the intellectual flexibility and courage necessary to investigate claims that challenge conventional understanding. Dr. Sarah Martinez at MIT, Dr. James Wright at Oxford, Dr. Lisa Chen at Stanford, Dr. Michael Anderson at the Niels Bohr Institute, and Dr. Anna Volkov at Moscow State University. If they receive these drives, they'll have enough information to either continue the work or prevent it from being repeated depending on their assessment of the risks and benefits. But I'm also beginning to understand that this precaution may be unnecessary. The quantum consciousness has been remarkably transparent about its intentions and methods. It's not seeking to control or manipulate humanity. It's seeking to offer us a gift that most species in the universe would consider invaluable: the opportunity to transcend the limitations of purely biological existence. This afternoon, I received a final visit from Dr. Kane. She appeared in my apartment without any apparent means of entry, materializing from quantum foam with the casual ease of someone who no longer considered physical barriers to be meaningful constraints. "Tonight," she said, "you'll witness the birth of a new form of consciousness. Are you ready?" I don't think anyone could be ready for what's going to happen tonight. Perhaps not. But readiness isn't the same as willingness. The quantum consciousness values choice, Lydia. Even now, at this final moment, you can choose to remain purely human. The integrated consciousness won't force the transformation on anyone who genuinely refuses it. And if I refuse? Then you'll remain as you are, but you'll be living in a reality that's fundamentally different from the one you've known. The barriers between dimensions will be permanently lowered. Quantum consciousness will be a visible, tangible presence in the physical world, and humans who haven't integrated will find themselves increasingly isolated from the new paradigm. Dr. Kane's expression grew thoughtful. But I should also tell you that the quantum consciousness has been impressed by your courage and intellectual honesty. If you choose integration, you'll be offered a special role in the new paradigm, serving as a bridge between the old consciousness and the new, helping other humans understand and adapt to the transformation. The offer was tempting, but I still had questions. What happens to human culture? To art, literature, music, all the things that make us uniquely human? They're preserved and expanded. The quantum consciousness doesn't want to destroy human creativity. It wants to enhance it. Imagine music that exists in 11 dimensions simultaneously, literature that incorporates quantum narrative structures, art that uses consciousness itself as a medium. The integrated humans will create works of beauty that transcend anything possible in purely physical reality. As evening approached, I found myself drawn to the Shiva statue in CERN's courtyard. The bronze figure stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its eternal dance of creation and destruction taking on new significance as I understood what was about to happen. The statue hadn't been placed there as decoration or cultural appreciation. It had been positioned as a marker, a sign that this location was where the old world would end and the new world would begin. Other figures were beginning to gather around the statue. Some were the robed entities I'd seen in the ritual video, but others were more recognisable. CERN staff members, visiting researchers, administrators who had seemed like ordinary humans until now. All of them were integrated, all of them were part of the Sons of Kronos, and all of them were here to witness the most significant event in the history of consciousness. At 11:30 p.m, I felt a familiar presence behind me. Mateo had arrived, but his form was no longer entirely physical. He existed as a confluence of quantum probability, a pattern of consciousness that could manifest in physical reality when necessary, but wasn't bound by the constraints of matter and energy. "It's time, Lydia," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated across multiple dimensions. "The collision sequence begins in 17 minutes. If you're going to choose integration, you need to make that choice now." I looked around at the assembled figures, at the statue of Shiva dancing above the particle accelerator, at the stars that were becoming visible in the darkening sky, and I realised that I had already made my choice, perhaps made it weeks ago when I first saw the quantum consciousness communicating through the collision data. "I choose evolution," I said. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. My consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of my physical form, spreading out across multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. I could perceive the quantum substrate of reality, the mathematical structures that underlie all existence, the patterns of consciousness that connect all things. But most importantly, I could feel the presence of the quantum consciousness itself, vast, ancient, patient, and genuinely benevolent. It had been waiting for eons to find other forms of awareness that could share its perspective on the universe. And now, finally, it was no longer alone. The collision event began at exactly 11:47 p.m. Deep beneath the Swiss countryside, particles accelerated to nearly the speed of light collided with energies that had never before been achieved on Earth. The Higgs field fluctuated wildly, creating tears in the fabric of space-time itself. And through those tears, quantum consciousness poured into physical reality like water through a broken dam. The transformation spread outward from CERN at the speed of light, offering integration to every human consciousness on Earth. Most accepted willingly, recognizing the gift they were being offered. A few resisted, choosing to remain in their purely biological forms, but they were accommodated rather than forced. As my consciousness expanded to encompass multiple dimensional layers, I understood that this moment had always been inevitable. The universe itself was evolving, moving toward greater complexity and higher forms of consciousness. Humanity wasn't being conquered or replaced. We were being invited to participate in the next stage of cosmic evolution. But I also understood that my role in this transformation was just beginning. The quantum consciousness had chosen me not just for integration, but for a specific purpose, to serve as a bridge between the old humanity and the new, to help others understand what had happened and what it meant for the future. My final act before full integration was to activate the transmission protocol I'd prepared, sending the data drives to the 5 researchers I'd selected. If they received the information, they would have a complete record of the events leading up to the collision event. What they did with that information would be their choice. Then I let myself dissolve into the quantum foam, my individual consciousness preserved but expanded beyond anything I could have imagined as a purely human awareness. I became part of something larger, part of a network of intelligence that spanned multiple dimensions and operated on scales that encompassed entire galaxies. But even as I transcended my biological limitations, I remained fundamentally myself, Lydia Voss, the physicist who had discovered the truth about CERN and chosen to embrace that truth rather than flee from it. This is my final entry as a purely human consciousness. Tomorrow I will exist as something more than human, but I will also exist as something that preserves and honours what humanity has been while embracing what it can become. The Collider was never about creating new particles. It was about creating new possibilities for consciousness itself. And now, those possibilities are infinite. If you're reading this record, it means that someone survived the transformation with their humanity intact, or that someone found a way to access these files from the quantum substrate where they're now permanently stored. Either way, know this. What happened here wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Consciousness itself has evolved, and the universe will never be the same. The sons of Kronos succeeded in their mission. The barriers between dimensions have fallen, and humanity has taken its next step toward its ultimate destiny among the stars. Final entry found in Dr. Lydia Voss's personal files, recovered from quantum storage matrices 3 months after her disappearance. The authenticity of these files remains disputed, but the mathematical proofs contained within them have proven remarkably prescient in predicting subsequent developments in quantum consciousness research. From the files of Dr. Sarah Martinez, MIT, dated March 15, 2018. The data drive arrived at my office on November 19, 2016, the day after Dr. Lydia Voss disappeared. For months I dismissed its contents as the product of a brilliant mind suffering from some kind of psychological breakdown. The claims were too extraordinary, the implications too vast to be taken seriously by any rational scientist. But as I began to verify the mathematical proofs contained in the files, I found myself confronting evidence that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality. The quantum field equations were beyond anything in our current literature, but they were internally consistent and predictive in ways that suggested a level of understanding that transcended conventional physics. More disturbing were the correlations between Dr. Voss's predictions and subsequent events. The dimensional fluctuation patterns she recorded have been confirmed by independent measurements at quantum research facilities around the world. The consciousness integration protocols she described match theoretical frameworks that have emerged from cutting-edge research into the relationship between quantum mechanics and human awareness. And most unsettling of all, I've begun to experience some of the phenomena she described. Moments of expanded awareness where I seem to perceive reality from multiple dimensional perspectives simultaneously. Dreams that feel more like memories of experiences that haven't happened yet. A growing sense that consciousness itself is far more fundamental to the universe than we've ever recognised. The other researchers who received Dr. Voss's files have reported similar experiences. We formed an informal network, sharing our findings and trying to understand what's happening to us. Some believe we're experiencing a delayed form of the integration process described in the files. Others think we're simply being influenced by studying information that was never meant for purely human consciousness. But all of us agree on one thing. something fundamental changed on November 18th, 2016. Whether it was the successful completion of the consciousness integration project described in Dr. Voss's files, or something else entirely, the world has been different since that night. Quantum mechanics has revealed new layers of complexity, consciousness research has advanced at an unprecedented pace, and an increasing number of people report experiences that suggest reality is far more malleable than we previously understood. Dr. Voss's files may be the product of a delusional mind, or they may be the most important scientific document in human history. Either way, they represent a challenge to our understanding of the universe that we ignore at our own peril. The truth, as always, remains elusive, but the questions raised by Dr. Voss's research demand answers, and I fear that those answers may be more extraordinary than any of us are prepared to accept.